thus have I heard. Once, the Blessed One was dwelling on Vulture Peak near Rajagriha, surrounded by a great assembly of monks. The evening was quiet. The last light of the sun rested upon the distant mountains, while a cool wind moved softly through the trees. Among the monks sat Ananda, the Buddha's devoted attendant. For many years, Ananda had witnessed the extraordinary patience of his teacher. He had seen angry men insult him, yet the Buddha answered without anger. He had seen those who came with suspicion leave with peaceful hearts. But there was one thing Ananda still could not understand. It concerned Devdatta. Devdatta had long been consumed by jealousy. He envied the respect given to the Buddha and wished to possess that honor for himself. Over time, envy became resentment, and resentment became hatred. Again and again, Devdatta tried to harm the Blessed One. He arranged for a drunken elephant to be driven toward him. He caused a great stone to be pushed from the mountain, hoping it would crush him. He searched for every possible way to bring danger upon the Buddha. Yet the Buddha never returned hatred with hatred. To Rahula, his own son, he showed compassion. To Devdatta, who wished for his death, he also showed compassion. Ananda could not understand how these two could be held in the same heart without distinction. At last he bowed before the Buddha. "Blessed One," he said, "Devdatta has harmed you again and again. He has been jealous of you, plotted against you, and even wished to take your life. Yet when you look upon him, I see no hatred." The Buddha remained silent. Ananda continued. "You care for Rahula with tenderness, yet you also regard Devdatta with compassion. How can one who causes suffering be treated with the same mercy as one who loves you?" The Buddha looked at Ananda calmly. "Ananda," he said, "this is not the first life in which Devdatta has wished to harm me." The monks listened more closely. "Nor is this the first life in which I have refused to hate him." Then the Buddha began to tell a story from an age beyond memory. Long ago, there was a mighty king named Ratnavarman, the king of the jeweled armor. He ruled over a vast and prosperous land, and 500 smaller kingdoms acknowledged his authority. His cities were rich, his armies powerful, and his treasuries filled with gold, pearls, precious stones, and rare goods from distant lands. The king also had 500 queens. Yet despite all his wealth, one sorrow followed him day and night. He had no child. Years passed, but no prince was born. The king made offerings to the gods. He invited priests and sages to perform rituals. He gave food to the poor and prayed beneath the stars. Still, the royal palace remained without an heir. One night, after many years of longing, the king had a strange dream. A radiant heavenly being appeared before him. "Great king," the being said, "do not grieve. Outside your city, deep within the forest, there live two holy ascetics. Their lives in that place are nearing their end. Invite them to your kingdom, for through old causes and conditions, they may be reborn into your royal family. The king awoke before dawn. The dream had been so vivid that he immediately summoned his ministers. That very morning, he traveled beyond the city walls and entered the forest. After a long journey, he found the two ascetics living quietly beneath ancient trees. One of them possessed a gentle golden radiance. His expression was peaceful, and even wild animals seemed unafraid in his presence. The king bowed before them and told them of his dream. The ascetics understood that their present lives were almost complete. Not long afterward, the golden ascetic passed away peacefully. At the same time, the chief queen dreamed that a golden light entered her body. 10 months later, she gave birth to a son. The child was beautiful beyond expectation. His skin shone with a warm golden hue, and his face was calm and dignified. Wise men examined him and said, "This prince carries the causes of great virtue. His heart will naturally turn toward generosity and compassion." The king named him Good Deed. Some time later, the second ascetic also passed away and was reborn through another queen. A second prince was born. He was named Evil Deed. The two brothers grew up beneath the same palace roof. They studied under the same teachers, ate from the same kitchens, and wore garments made by the same craftsmen. Yet their hearts were very different. Whenever Good Deed received something beautiful, he wondered who else might need it. Whenever Evil Deed received something valuable, he worried that someone might take it away. One brother felt joy in giving. The other felt security in possessing. And so, long before either of them crossed the great ocean, the currents of their destinies had already begun to flow in opposite directions. As the years passed, Good Deed grew into a young man admired throughout the kingdom. He was not admired merely because he was handsome, nor because he was the eldest prince. People loved him because he noticed suffering. When servants carried burdens too heavy for them, he would stop and help. When old men waited at the palace gates, he listened to their troubles. When injured animals were brought before him, he ordered that they be fed and treated rather than abandoned. The king often smiled at his son's generosity. But sometimes he also worried. "You cannot rescue every creature in the world," he once told him. Good Deed lowered his head respectfully. "Perhaps not, father. But if suffering stands before me, how can I pretend not to see it?" One morning, the prince asked to leave the palace and travel through the countryside. He wished to see the kingdom not from behind curtains and painted walls, but as ordinary people saw it. So he dressed simply and rode beyond the capital. At first, the day seemed peaceful. Farmers worked beneath the sun. Children played near irrigation channels. Birds moved across the fields. But as the prince traveled farther, another world began to reveal itself. He saw a hungry man sitting beside the road with an empty bowl. He saw a mother dividing a small piece of bread among several children. He passed a butcher's yard and heard frightened animals struggling against ropes. Farther on, hunters returned from the forest carrying dead birds and deer. He saw insects crushed beneath plows. He saw exhausted oxen driven forward beneath the whip. Everywhere he looked, life seemed to survive by leaning upon the pain of other life. The prince's heart grew heavy. That evening, he returned to the palace but did not go first to his chambers. Instead, he walked directly to the royal treasury. The doors opened before him. Inside were rooms filled with gold coins, pearls, coral, silver vessels, rare cloth, sandalwood, ivory, and precious stones gathered over generations. The treasurer bowed. "All of this belongs to the royal house, Your Highness. One day, much of it will be yours." Good Deed picked up a single gold coin. He looked at it for a long time. How many hungry people can this feed? The treasurer hesitated. Perhaps several families for a short while. The prince looked around at the countless chests. And all of this? A great many people, Your Highness. For how long? The treasurer did not answer immediately. At last he said quietly, "Not forever." Those two words remained in the prince's heart. Not forever. The palace contained wealth beyond counting, yet even such wealth could be exhausted. If he gave away 10,000 coins, there would be 10,000 fewer. If he opened every storehouse, one day the storehouses would become empty. And when the treasure was gone, suffering would still remain. That night, Good Deed could not sleep. He remembered an old story told by merchants who had crossed distant seas. Beyond the known coast, somewhere in the great ocean, there was said to be an island filled with jewels. And beyond even that, according to ancient sailors, there existed a miraculous gem known as the wish-fulfilling jewel. It was said that whoever possessed it could cause precious things to appear in abundance. Many considered it only a legend. But the prince thought differently. If such a jewel truly exists, he said to himself, then I must seek it. Not to make his crown heavier. Not to build another palace. Not to become more powerful than neighboring kings. He wanted it so that the poor would not hunger. So that widows and orphans would not be abandoned. So that those without shelter could be protected. So that giving would not end when a treasury became empty. The next morning, he entered the royal hall and bowed before his father and mother. "Father, Mother, I ask permission to cross the great ocean." The queen's face changed immediately. "The ocean?" The king frowned. "For what purpose?" to seek the wish-fulfilling jewel. The hall became silent. Then the king rose. No. Good Deed remained kneeling. Father, please hear me. I have heard enough. The king's voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear. Do you know how many ships leave our harbors and never return? The sea has storms greater than palaces. There are hidden reefs, whirlpools, strange winds, and creatures no man understands. The queen came down from her seat. She placed both hands on her son's shoulders. My child, if you want to give away gold, take all the gold in the palace. If you want pearls, take every pearl I own. If you wish to help the poor, I will help you distribute everything. Good Deed looked at her gently. Mother, that is exactly why I must go. Everything here can be exhausted. Tears filled her eyes. Then let it be exhausted. Better an empty treasury than an empty place where my son wants Saturday. For a moment, Good Deed could not speak. He loved his parents deeply. Their grief hurt him more than any danger he imagined upon the sea, but compassion had already become stronger than comfort. He bowed until his forehead touched the floor. I do not seek danger, he said. I seek a way to give without end. The king still refused. So Good Deed stopped eating. He did not shout. He did not threaten anyone. He simply remained silent and firm. One day passed. Then 2. Then 3. By the 6th day, the queen could no longer bear to see him weakened. The king sat beside him for a long time. At last he said, If I forbid you, I may lose you here. If I allow you, I may lose you to the sea. Good Deed took his father's hand. I will return if causes allow it. The king closed his eyes. Then, with great sorrow, he gave permission. News of the voyage spread quickly. Good Deed announced that any merchant willing to cross the sea might travel with him. 500 merchants came forward. They were men accustomed to danger, profit, storms, foreign ports, and long roads. The prince also sought an experienced navigator. Among those recommended to him was an old blind guide who had spent most of his life at sea. Though his eyes no longer saw, he knew the winds, currents, stars, reefs, and signs of weather better than younger sailors with perfect sight. Good Deed invited him to join. The old man agreed. And while the city prepared ships, food, rope, water, sails, and tools, another heart in the palace became restless. Evil Deed had heard everything. His brother was going in search of a jewel that could create endless treasure. And a single thought began to poison his mind: if he returns with such a treasure, the people will love him even more. Then when father grows old, who will inherit the throne? For the first time, Evil Deed did not merely envy his brother's goodness. He began to fear it. The day of departure finally arrived. Before sunrise, the harbor was already awake. Men carried jars of fresh water onto the ships. Sailors checked ropes, sails, anchors, and wooden planks. Merchants counted their provisions again and again. Families stood along the shore, speaking quietly to those they loved. Some tried to smile. Others wept openly. Good Deed arrived with the old blind navigator beside him. The prince wore no heavy ornaments. He had chosen simple clothing suitable for travel, and before boarding the ship, he turned toward the city one last time. His father and mother had come to the harbor. The queen's eyes were red from crying. The king stood beside her, trying to remain composed before the people, but when Good Deed bowed, the king stepped forward and embraced him. "Remember," he said, "no treasure is worth your life." Good Deed answered softly, "Father, I will remember that life is more precious than treasure." Evil Deed stood nearby. He had insisted on joining the voyage. At first, the king refused him as well. But Evil Deed argued that if danger threatened his elder brother, he should be there to help. The words sounded loyal. The intention behind them was not. He wished to see the jewel with his own eyes. And if possible, he wished to possess it. At last the ships left the harbor. The shoreline slowly became smaller. The palace towers disappeared. The mountains faded into mist. For many of the merchants, the journey was familiar. They had sailed before and knew the rhythm of long days at sea. But for Good Deed, everything was new. The ocean seemed endless. By day, sunlight scattered across the water like broken silver. By night, the sky became so full of stars that it seemed another ocean had opened above them. The blind navigator would sit near the mast and listen. He listened to the wind. He listened to the way waves struck the hull. He smelled the air and touched the ropes. Sometimes he would suddenly say, "Turn slightly south," or "Reduce the sail before sunset." The younger sailors wondered how he could know. But again and again, his judgment proved correct. One evening, Good Deed sat beside him. "Master," the prince asked, "how do you guide a ship when you cannot see the sea?" The old man smiled. "When I had eyes, I trusted them too much." Good Deed waited. The navigator continued, "The sea teaches you that seeing is only one kind of knowing. Winds speak. Water speaks. Wood speaks. Birds speak. Clouds speak. If you become quiet enough, the world tells you where you are." Good Deed remembered those words. Perhaps, he thought, the heart was the same. A noisy heart could not hear much. A quiet heart might hear suffering before it became a cry. Days turned into weeks. The fleet crossed calm waters, then rougher ones. At times, waves rose high enough to hide one ship from another. At other times, the sea became so still that the sails hung motionless. The merchants grew impatient whenever progress slowed. Many had not joined because of compassion. They had joined because they had heard of the treasure islands. They dreamed of returning home rich. One night, a storm formed in the distance. The sky darkened. The old navigator raised his face toward the wind. "Lower the sails." Some merchants protested. "The wind is strong. We can travel faster." The old man repeated, "Lower the sails." Good Deed immediately ordered the sailors to obey. Not long afterward, the storm struck. The wind screamed across the deck. Rain fell so heavily that men could barely see one another. The sea lifted the ships and dropped them into black valleys of water. Merchants clung to ropes. Some cried out to the gods. Evil Deed gripped the side of the vessel, terrified. For the first time, thoughts of kingship and treasure disappeared from his mind. He wanted only to survive. Good Deed moved among the sailors, helping where he could. "Secure that rope. Help him stand. Do not leave anyone alone near the edge." The storm lasted through the night. By dawn, it had weakened. The fleet had survived. Several masts were damaged, but no ship had been lost. The merchants praised the blind navigator. He only said, "The sea spared us because we listened before it shouted." After many more days, birds appeared overhead. The old man smiled when he heard their cries. Land is near. Excitement spread across the ships. By afternoon, the merchants saw an island rising from the horizon. As they approached, sunlight struck the shore strangely. Something flashed among the rocks. Then another light. Then hundreds. The beach itself seemed to glitter. They had reached the island of jewels. When the ships anchored, the merchants rushed ashore. They found pearls among the sand. Crystals lay between stones. Pieces of coral, silver ore, and precious gems were scattered across the island. The men shouted with joy. Some laughed like children. Some fell to their knees and filled their hands. Good Deed watched them. Then he raised his voice. "Friends, take what you need, but remember the sea." The merchants turned toward him. "Our ships must carry us home. If we overload them, the treasure we gather will become the cause of our deaths." Some nodded. Others continued filling sacks. Evil Deed walked among them. He lifted a large gem in his hand. "Do not listen to fear," he said. The merchants looked at him. "We crossed the ocean for this. Who knows whether we will ever return? Take everything you can carry." Good Deed approached. "Brother, enough." Evil Deed smiled. Enough for whom? For the ships. There is still space. Space is not the same as safety. Evil Deed turned toward the merchants. Would you cross storms and risk death only to leave treasure lying on the ground? That question stirred their greed. More sacks were filled. Boxes meant for food were emptied and packed with stones. Water jars were moved to make room for gems. Good Deed tried again to warn them. But the sight of treasure had changed their minds. Men who had feared death during the storm now behaved as though death could be purchased away with jewels. Only the blind navigator remained calm. He stood beside Good Deed and said quietly, "Prince, there are storms in the sea." Then he touched his chest. "And there are storms here." Good Deed understood. The second kind was often more dangerous. At last the ships were loaded. Too heavily. The deck sat lower in the water than before. Good Deed looked at them with concern. He knew the return journey would be dangerous. But the merchants were laughing. They saw only what they had gained. None of them imagined how quickly treasure could become weight. And far beyond the island, where the horizon had already begun to darken, another storm was waiting. The ships left the island beneath a pale morning sky. At first, the sea seemed merciful. The wind was steady, the sails were full, and the merchants moved across the decks with satisfied faces. Everywhere there were sacks of gems, boxes of pearls, bundles of coral, chunks of precious stone wrapped in cloth. Men who had once feared the ocean now sat beside their treasure and spoke excitedly of the lives they would live when they returned home. One would buy land. Another would build a great house. Another dreamed of servants, horses, and feasts. Good Deed listened in silence. He did not begrudge them their hopes. But whenever he looked at how low the ships sat in the water, uneasiness returned. The blind navigator noticed it too. He touched the side of the vessel and frowned. "Too heavy," he said. Good Deed nodded. "I warned them." The old man replied, "A warning heard by the ears is not always heard by the heart." Before sunset, clouds gathered in the west. They were not ordinary clouds. They rose in towering black masses, layer upon layer, until they covered the remaining light. The wind changed. The blind navigator lifted his face sharply. "Throw some of the treasure overboard." The merchants stared at him. No one moved. He spoke again. "Throw it overboard now." A merchant clutched a sack to his chest. "We nearly died to obtain this." The old navigator answered, if you keep it, you may die because of it. Another merchant protested, the ship survived the last storm. They were lighter then. Good Deed stepped forward. Listen to him. Keep only what is necessary. Your lives are worth more than these stones. For a moment, the men hesitated. Then thunder rolled across the sea. The first merchant opened his sack. He looked inside at the jewels shining in the dim light. His hands tightened. I will throw them away when the storm becomes worse. Others agreed. When it becomes necessary. But greed always believes necessity is still one moment away. The rain began. Within minutes, the sea changed. The calm surface broke apart beneath violent wind. Waves rose against the overloaded ships. Water crashed across the decks. Sailors shouted. Cut the ropes. Lower the sails. Bail out the water. Good Deed joined them. But every movement of the ships was slow and heavy. The treasure held them down. A great wave struck one vessel from the side. The ship tilted. Boxes slid across the deck. Men screamed. Another wave followed. The vessel disappeared behind a wall of black water. When it emerged again, one mast was gone. Now the merchants understood. Throw it away. Sacks were opened. Jewels were poured into the sea. Pearls rolled across the deck and vanished between the planks. Men who only moments earlier had refused to surrender a single gem now threw away fortunes with trembling hands. But they had waited too long. Another ship split against the force of the waves. A third began filling with water. Good Deed heard cries from every direction. The darkness was filled with broken wood, ropes, shattered boxes, and desperate voices. Then a tremendous wave struck his own ship. The deck vanished beneath him. For an instant, there was only cold water and darkness. He did not know which way was upward. His body struck something hard. He opened his eyes, but the sea was black. Then his hand touched the small sacred jewel he had obtained separately on the island, the wish-fulfilling gem he had guarded close to his body. He grasped it tightly. At last he reached the surface. He gasped for air. All around him, the fleet was breaking apart. He saw men clinging to wood. He heard prayers. He heard cries for mothers, wives, children, gods. Then the storm swallowed those voices one by one. Good Deed tried to reach anyone he could. But the waves were too strong. One by one, lights disappeared. One by one, hands vanished beneath the water. The 500 merchants who had crossed the sea dreaming of wealth were lost to the ocean. Their treasure sank with them. Gold rested beside drowned wood. Pearls disappeared into the depths. The sea made no distinction between a stone worth a kingdom and an ordinary pebble. In the darkness, Good Deed floated alone. Or so he thought. Then he heard a voice. "Brother." He turned. Far behind him, Evil Deed was struggling in the water. "Brother, help me." Good Deed began swimming toward him. A wave separated them. Then another brought them closer. Evil Deed was exhausted. His movements were weak. His face showed pure terror. "Do not leave me." Good Deed reached him and took hold of his arm. For a moment, both sank beneath the surface. Good Deed kicked upward with all his strength. When they rose again, Evil Deed wrapped his arms around him desperately. "Calm yourself," Good Deed said. "If you hold too tightly, we will both drown. I cannot swim anymore." "I know." Good Deed placed one arm beneath his brother and used the other to keep them above the waves. Hour after hour, he struggled. The storm gradually weakened. The sea remained rough, but the black clouds began to break. At dawn, the two brothers were still alive. Evil Deed opened his eyes and saw that Good Deed was still supporting him. He also saw something else. Around his brother's neck, beneath the torn cloth, a golden light flickered. The jewel. The true jewel. Not one of the ordinary gems from the island. The wish-fulfilling treasure Good Deed had crossed the ocean to find. Even after losing the ships, the merchants, and everything else, he still possessed it. Evil Deed stared. His exhaustion did not remove his jealousy. It only made it quieter. By afternoon, they saw land. A small island. With their last strength, the brothers reached the shore and collapsed upon the sand. For a long time, neither moved. The sound of the storm faded into the distance. Good Deed finally opened his eyes. "We survived," he whispered. Evil Deed said nothing. He was looking at the jewel. Good Deed turned toward him. "Rest, brother. Tomorrow we will find a way home." Evil Deed closed his eyes. But in his heart there was no rest. The ocean had taken 500 lives. It had taken ships, gold, pearls, and every treasure the merchants had gathered. Yet one treasure remained. And Evil Deed began to think, if only that jewel were mine. The island was small and silent. There were no houses, no roads, and no smoke rising from distant fires. Only wind moved through the trees. After the storm, even the sea seemed tired. Good Deed and Evil Deed remained on the shore for most of the day. Their clothes were torn. Their hands were cut from broken wood and rope. Salt dried on their skin. Good Deed searched the island for fruit and fresh water. At last he found a small spring beneath a cluster of rocks and several trees bearing wild fruit. He brought what he could back to his brother. "Eat slowly," he said. "Your strength will return." Evil Deed accepted the fruit. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was filled with memories of the storm. 500 merchants had been alive only the day before. Now none remained. Good Deed closed his eyes and thought of them. He remembered their laughter on the island of jewels. Their plans for new houses. Their promises to their families. Their frightened voices in the darkness. His heart was heavy. Evil Deed watched him. "You still grieve for them?" "Yes." "They chose to overload the ships." Good Deed opened his eyes. "That does not make their deaths less painful." "They ignored your warning." "Yes." "Then why mourn?" "Because suffering does not become smaller simply because someone helped create it." Evil Deed looked away. He did not understand this way of thinking. To him, fault decided everything. If a man caused his own downfall, then his suffering belonged to him. If another person was foolish, why carry that person's sorrow? Good Deed saw things differently. Pain was pain. That alone was enough to awaken compassion. As evening approached, the sky became clear. Stars appeared slowly above the sea. Good Deed removed the wish-fulfilling jewel from beneath his clothing. Even in darkness, it gave off a soft golden glow. Evil Deed's eyes fixed upon it. "So it is real," he said. Good Deed nodded. "Yes." "And it can truly produce treasure?" "If the old teachings are correct." "You risked everything for this." "I risked everything so it could be used." Evil Deed frowned. "There is a difference." "A great one." Good Deed held the jewel carefully in his palm. "If I merely possess it, then it becomes another object guarded by fear." He looked toward the dark sea. "If it is used to relieve hunger, debt, cold, and suffering, then perhaps its value becomes real." Evil Deed said nothing. He imagined returning to the capital with the jewel. He imagined the palace gates opening. He imagined ministers kneeling. He imagined the people shouting his name. If he alone possessed such a treasure, what king could rival him? What brother could stand above him? Good Deed wrapped the jewel again and tied it securely beneath his clothes. "Sleep," he said. "At dawn, we should search the far side of the island. Perhaps passing ships come near this coast." Evil Deed lay down. Good Deed rested beneath a tree. The prince had barely slept since the shipwreck. He had spent much of the storm keeping his brother alive. His whole body ached. Soon, his breathing became slow and deep. Evil Deed remained awake. Moonlight moved across the sand. He listened to the waves. Then he listened to his brother's breathing. Again and again, the same thoughts circled in his mind. He has the jewel. He saved me. He is the elder prince. The people already love him. If he returns with the jewel, Father will surely choose him. Another voice arose quietly within him. He saved your life. Evil Deed pushed the thought away. Without him, you would have drowned. He turned onto his side. Then I owe him gratitude. For a few moments, his mind softened. He remembered Good Deed swimming through the black water toward him. He remembered the arm holding him above the waves. He remembered his own desperate cry, "Do not leave me." And Good Deed had not left him. Evil Deed closed his eyes. For an instant, shame entered his heart. But shame is painful. And rather than remain with that pain, he turned it into resentment. Why must he always be the better one? Why must he always be the generous one? Why must even my life depend upon him? The more he thought, the more gratitude began to feel like humiliation. His brother's goodness became unbearable. Slowly, Evil Deed sat up. Good Deed was still sleeping. The golden jewel was hidden beneath his clothes. Evil Deed looked around. Near the edge of the trees grew a thorny shrub. Its branches were covered with long, hard spikes. He walked toward it. His hand trembled as he broke off 2 sharp thorns. For a long time, he stood motionless. He could still turn back. He could throw the thorns away. He could lie down beside his brother and wake in the morning as the man whose life had been saved. No one forced him forward. There was no storm now. No enemy. No hunger. Only a choice. He returned to the tree. Good Deed slept peacefully. Evil Deed knelt beside him. One last thought came, "Brother." Then greed answered, "The jewel." Evil Deed raised his hand. The thorn entered Good Deed's eye. The prince awoke with a cry. Before he could understand what was happening, Evil Deed seized his head and drove the second thorn into the other eye. Good Deed screamed. He reached out blindly. "Brother!" Blood ran down his face. "What are you doing?" Evil Deed's breathing was wild. He tore open Good Deed's clothing and seized the jewel. Golden light flashed across his hands. For a moment, the whole dark shore seemed illuminated. Good Deed lay on the ground, both hands covering his ruined eyes. Evil Deed. His voice was weak. There was no anger in it. Only disbelief and pain. Why? Evil Deed stood above him. He had imagined this moment many times. He had imagined triumph. Instead, he felt fear. He could not answer. Good Deed spoke again. I saved you. The words were quiet. Evil Deed flinched. He gripped the jewel more tightly. Then he turned away. Behind him, Good Deed called, "Brother, do not leave me here blind." Evil Deed stopped. The sea moved softly against the shore. For one heartbeat, he almost returned. Then he looked at the jewel. And he walked away. By dawn, he had found fishermen on the far side of the island and persuaded them to take him toward the mainland. He did not tell them about his brother. He did not look back. Good Deed remained alone beneath the tree. When morning light reached the island, he could no longer see it. He could only feel warmth upon his face. He tried to stand. Pain shot through his eyes. The world had become darkness. He touched the ground, searching for the sound of footsteps that were no longer there. Brother? Nothing answered. Only the waves. Good Deed slowly understood. The jewel was gone. His brother was gone. His sight was gone. Everything he had crossed the ocean to accomplish seemed lost in a single night. For the first time since the journey began, Good Deed felt despair rise within him. He lowered his head. But after a long time, another thought came. He was ruled by fear and greed. Good Deed pressed his hands against the earth. What kind of suffering must exist inside a heart that can do such a thing? Even now, wounded and abandoned, he could not bring himself to hate his brother. He wept. Not only because he was blind. Not only because the jewel had been stolen. He wept because Evil Deed had fallen so deeply into darkness. And beneath the morning sky, the prince who had lost his eyes began the next part of his journey without knowing where a single step would lead. For many days, Good Deed remained on the island. Without sight, even the simplest things became difficult. He learned to recognize the path between the tree and the spring by touching the ground with a branch. He counted his steps. He listened for the sound of water. He searched for fallen fruit with his hands. At night, he no longer knew when the stars appeared. But he could hear the sea. Sometimes he wondered whether he would die there. Yet whenever despair arose, he remembered the purpose for which he had crossed the ocean. He had gone seeking a jewel to relieve suffering. Now suffering had come directly to him. It was no longer something he observed from a horse or considered inside a treasury. It lived inside his own body. He understood hunger differently now. He understood helplessness. He understood what it meant to reach out a hand without knowing whether anyone would take it. One morning, while sitting near the shore, Good Deed heard something unfamiliar. Voices. He stood quickly. Is someone there? The voices stopped. Then a man shouted, "Who are you?" Good Deed lifted both hands. A traveler. Several fishermen had landed on the island to collect water. When they approached, they saw his torn clothes and wounded eyes. "What happened to you?" Good Deed was silent for a moment. He could have told them everything. He could have said, "My brother blinded me and stole my treasure." Instead, he answered, "My companions and I suffered disaster at sea. I was separated from them." It was true. But it did not condemn his brother. The fishermen gave him food and carried him onto their boat. Days later, they reached the coast of another kingdom. Good Deed thanked them and stepped onto unfamiliar land with nothing. No servants. No royal clothing. No money. No jewel. Not even his sight. He walked with a wooden staff. At first, he survived by begging. He sat near roads and marketplaces and listened to footsteps pass. Some people gave him rice. Some gave fruit. Some ignored him. Others spoke harshly. "You are young. Why do you beg?" Good Deed never answered with anger. When someone placed food in his hand, he thanked them. When no one did, he endured hunger. Months passed. The softness of palace life disappeared from his hands and feet. His skin darkened beneath the sun. His clothes became those of an ordinary wanderer. No one who saw him would have guessed that he had once slept beneath embroidered curtains in the palace of a mighty king. Eventually, Good Deed arrived in the kingdom of Lishabhadra. Near the capital, he heard workers speaking about employment in the royal orchards. The gardens were vast, and the king required men to guard the fruit from thieves and animals. Good Deed followed the sound of their voices and asked for work. The overseer looked at his eyes. "You are blind." "Yes. How can a blind man guard an orchard?" Good Deed smiled faintly. "I cannot see who enters. But I can hear footsteps, broken branches, birds, monkeys, and fruit falling from trees." The overseer laughed. Yet there was something calm and trustworthy in the stranger's voice. "Very well. I will give you a small section. If half the fruit disappears, you will leave." Good Deed bowed. "Thank you." So the prince became a keeper of fruit trees. Every morning, he walked slowly among them with his staff. He learned where each tree stood. He learned the sound of wind moving through different leaves. He could tell when monkeys entered the branches. He could hear children creeping through dry grass. Soon, the overseer discovered that less fruit disappeared from good deeds section than from many sections guarded by sighted men. The blind keeper was allowed to remain. His life became simple. At sunrise, he worked. At noon, he rested beneath the trees. At night, he slept in a small shelter near the garden. One possession remained with him, a simple stringed instrument that a traveler had once given him in exchange for help. Good Deed learned to play it. When darkness came, he sat beneath the trees and let music fill the orchard. The melodies were gentle. They carried something of the ocean. Something of distant palaces. Something of grief that had passed through the heart without becoming hatred. One evening, Princess Lishabhadra, daughter of the king, entered the royal garden with her attendants. She had come to enjoy the cool air after a hot day. As she walked beneath the trees, she suddenly raised her hand. "Wait!" The attendants stopped. From somewhere deeper in the orchard came the sound of music. It was quiet, not the polished music of court musicians. It was simpler than that. Yet the princess felt strangely unable to continue walking. "Who is playing?" An attendant answered, perhaps one of the garden workers. The princess followed the sound. Beneath an old tree sat a blind man in plain clothing. His face bore scars around the eyes. His hands moved gently across the instrument. He did not know that a princess stood before him. When the melody ended, she asked, "What song was that?" Good Deed turned toward the voice. "A song without a name." "You composed it?" "Perhaps the sea did." The princess smiled. "The sea?" "I listened to it for many days." There was something unusual in the way he spoke. No flattery. No nervousness. No attempt to impress her. She sat at a distance. "Were you a sailor?" "No." "A merchant?" "No." "Then why were you at sea?" Good Deed paused. "To look for something that I thought might help many people." "Did you find it?" "Yes." "And did it help them?" "No." "Then your journey failed?" Good Deed was silent. Finally, he said, "I once thought so." The princess waited. But perhaps a journey can lose its intended treasure and still teach the traveler what he needed to learn. "What did you learn?" Good Deed touched the instrument. "That when a man has food, he thinks hunger is simple." He paused. "When he can see, he thinks blindness is only the absence of sight." The princess's expression changed. "And when he has never been abandoned, he thinks loneliness is merely being alone." The evening wind moved through the trees. The princess asked softly, "Who abandoned you?" Good Deed smiled. "Someone who was suffering more deeply than I understood." The answer puzzled her. Do you hate that person? No. Not even for your eyes? Good Deed shook his head. If I add hatred to blindness, then I have lost more than my sight. The princess said nothing. She had grown up surrounded by learned teachers. She had heard philosophers speak of virtue. She had listened to priests recite sacred verses. But the blind gardener's simple words remained in her mind long after she returned to the palace. The next evening, she came again. And the evening after that. Sometimes Good Deed played music. Sometimes they spoke. He still did not tell her that he was a prince. He did not speak of the wish-fulfilling jewel. He did not speak his brother's name. The princess knew only that beneath the scars and poor clothing was a man whose heart had survived something his body had not escaped. And gradually, without intending it, she began to love him. The princess continued to visit the orchard. At first, she came every few days. Then every evening. Her attendants began to notice. Whenever the sun lowered behind the palace walls, the princess would find some reason to walk toward the gardens. Sometimes she brought fruit. Sometimes she brought nothing at all. Good Deed never asked why she returned. He only welcomed her voice. One evening, after he finished playing, the princess asked, "If you could have one thing restored to you, what would you choose?" Good Deed thought for a while. "My sight would be useful." The princess smiled sadly. "That is not the answer I expected." "What did you expect?" "That you would ask for the jewel you lost." Good Deed lowered his hands from the instrument. "The jewel was never meant to belong to me." "But you crossed the ocean for it." "Yes." "And someone stole it." "Yes." "Then surely you want it back." Good Deed turned his face toward the sound of leaves moving in the wind. "I want what it was meant to do." The princess did not understand. "What do you mean?" "If the jewel still brings relief to suffering, then whether it rests in my hand or another man's hand matters less. But what if the one who took it uses it selfishly?" Good Deed was silent. "That would be sorrowful." "Would that not make you angry?" "It would make me grieve." "Only grieve?" Good Deed smiled faintly. "Anger sometimes feels like strength because it burns hot." He touched his chest. "But if I allow it to live here, then the person who harmed me continues to shape my life long after the wound was given." The princess remembered those words. She had been raised in a royal court where insults could begin feuds lasting generations. A careless word at a banquet could become a political rivalry. A wounded pride could become war. Yet this blind man spoke as though forgiveness were not weakness, but freedom. The next day, the princess went before her father. The king was reviewing matters of state when she entered. He looked up. "You rarely come to me at this hour. What troubles you?" "Father, I wish to marry." The king smiled immediately. "So at last you are willing to discuss the princes who have sent proposals?" "No." His smile faded. "Then whom?" "The man I have chosen." The king sat straighter. "Who is he?" The princess answered, "A keeper in the royal orchard." For several breaths, the hall was silent. "A gardener?" "Yes." The king stared at her. "Which family?" "I do not know." "What land?" "I do not know." "What rank?" "He has none here." The king's expression hardened. "You wish to marry a man whose family, country, and rank you do not know?" The princess took a breath. "He is also blind." The king rose so suddenly that the ministers nearby lowered their heads. "Blind?" "Yes." "You are the daughter of a king." "I know. Princes from powerful kingdoms have asked for your hand." "I know." "And you reject them for a blind gardener?" The princess remained calm. "I do not choose a husband because his horse is taller, his palace larger, or his jewels brighter." The king looked at her in disbelief. "You are speaking like someone under a spell." "No, father. Perhaps for the first time, I am choosing without one." The king ordered that the gardener be brought before him. Good Deed entered the court with his wooden staff. He wore simple clothing. When he heard the king's voice, he bowed. "What have you done to my daughter?" the king demanded. "Nothing, your majesty. She says she wishes to marry you." Good Deed was silent. The king leaned forward. "Did you persuade her?" "No." "Did you tell her you possess secret powers?" "No." "Did you promise her anything?" "No." The king looked at his daughter. "Then explain this madness." The princess stepped forward. "I have listened to many men speak of honor. I have met men who speak beautifully of courage, mercy, and wisdom." She looked toward Good Deed. "But this man lost almost everything, and still did not become cruel." The king's anger softened slightly, though his concern remained. He turned to Good Deed. "Who are you?" "A traveler who suffered misfortune." "That is not enough." "It is all I am prepared to say." The king narrowed his eyes. "You refuse to tell a king your origin?" "I do not mean disrespect." "Then why hide it?" Good Deed answered quietly, because a man's birth can cause others to see what they expect rather than what stands before them. The court became still. The king studied him for a long time. There was dignity in the blind man's posture. Not pride. Not fear. Something else. At last the king said, "My daughter is stubborn. I know that better than anyone." A few ministers almost smiled. "If I forbid this marriage, she may refuse every marriage after it." He sighed. "So I will not force her." The princess bowed deeply. The wedding was held without the extravagance usually given to a royal marriage. Many nobles whispered. Some mocked the princess privately. They could not understand why someone born into wealth would choose a blind man with no known name. But the princess seemed peaceful. After the marriage, Good Deed continued to live simply. He did not demand servants. He did not ask for jewels. He still played music in the evenings. One night, the princess sat beside him. She had been silent for a long time. Then she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "Do you truly trust me?" "Yes." "Then why do I still feel that part of your life is closed to me?" Good Deed's hands became still. The princess continued, "I do not need your family name. I do not need to know whether you were rich or poor." She touched his hand. "But I want to know whether you believe I would remain beside you if I knew everything." Good Deed turned toward her. "I believe you would." "Then tell me one thing." "What?" "Tell me the truth about your eyes." A long silence followed. At last Good Deed spoke. "My brother blinded me." The princess froze. "Your brother?" "Yes." "And you still do not hate him?" "No." She could not understand. "Did he attack you in anger?" "No." "Was it an accident?" "No." "Then why?" "To take something I possessed." The princess's voice became quiet. "And after that, he abandoned you?" "Yes." She felt anger rise on his behalf. "How can you speak of him without hatred?" Good Deed answered, "Because hatred would not restore my eyes." The princess looked down. "It might at least honor the wrong done to you." "No." Good Deed shook his head. "Justice may name a wrong. Wisdom may prevent it from happening again. But hatred does not honor pain." He paused. "It only gives pain another body to live in." The princess's anger slowly softened into sorrow. She took both his hands. Then she closed her eyes. "I will make a vow." Good Deed turned toward her. "What vow?" She knelt beside him. "If this man before me has truly kept his heart free from malice toward the one who blinded him." Her voice trembled. "If his compassion is genuine, and if he has spoken truthfully." She pressed his hands between hers. Then by the power of truth, may one of his eyes be restored. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Good Deed suddenly drew in a breath. A faint warmth spread across one side of his face. The darkness changed. At first, he saw only light. Blurred. Soft. Almost painful. Then shapes began to form. The outline of the room. The flame of a lamp. And before him, the face of the princess. One eye had opened. Good Deed stared at her. She covered her mouth. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "You can see me?" Good Deed could not answer. He had forgotten how astonishing light was. The gold of the lamp. The red cloth at her shoulder. The tears shining upon her face. For the first time since the island, the world had returned. The princess began to weep. Then, without hesitation, she made a second vow. "If my first words were true, then let truth complete what it has begun." She raised her face. "May his other eye also be restored." Warmth spread again. Good Deed closed both eyes. When he opened them, the darkness was gone. He could see with both eyes. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The princess held him. Good Deed wept quietly. Not because his suffering had been erased. It had not. The ocean still existed. The dead merchants still existed. The betrayal still existed. But now, after so much darkness, light had returned. And sometimes healing did not mean that the past disappeared. It meant that the past no longer decided what the future was allowed to become. News of the miracle spread quickly through the palace. Servants whispered about it in the corridors. Ministers repeated the story in the court. The blind gardener, they said, had opened his eyes. Not one eye. Both. The king himself came to see. When Good Deed entered the hall without his wooden staff, the king stared at him for a long time. The man before him no longer looked like a helpless wanderer. His posture was straight. His face, though still marked by suffering, carried a quiet dignity that seemed strangely familiar to those who had spent their lives around royalty. The king spoke slowly. "Now that your sight has returned, I will ask you once more. Good Deed bowed. Who are you? This time, he did not remain silent. I was born in the kingdom of King Ratnavarman, the king of the jeweled armor. Several ministers immediately looked at one another. The name was known throughout many lands. Good Deed continued, I am his eldest son. The king's expression changed. You are a prince? Yes. And you became a keeper in my orchard? Yes. Why did you not tell us? Good Deed answered, when I arrived here, I had no crown, no treasure, and no sight. If I had spoken of my birth, perhaps people would have thought me mad. He smiled faintly. And perhaps it was useful for me to learn who I was when no one bowed. The king looked toward his daughter. So you married a prince without knowing it? The princess smiled. I married the gardener. Good Deed turned toward her. And that is why I will never forget what she gave me. The king ordered messengers to investigate his story. Travelers were questioned. Merchants from distant roads were summoned. Eventually, the truth became clear. In the kingdom of the jeweled armor, a prince named Good Deed had indeed disappeared at sea. A second prince, Evil Deed, had returned alone. He had told the court that storms had destroyed the expedition and that all others were dead. When the king heard this, he became very still. So your brother returned home? Yes. And he told them you were dead? It seems so. The king's face darkened. And he is the one who blinded you? Good Deed did not answer immediately. The princess looked at him. He had protected the truth for a long time. At last he said, yes. The king struck the arm of his chair. He should be punished. Good Deed remained calm. Perhaps. The king stared at him. Perhaps? He committed a terrible wrong. Then why do you speak as though there is doubt? Because punishment and hatred are not the same thing. The king said nothing. Good Deed continued, if punishment protects others and stops further harm, it may be necessary. He paused. But if punishment is only another name for revenge, then suffering merely changes hands. The king studied him. You still intend to forgive him? I do not know what he has become. Good Deed's voice grew softer. But I know what I do not wish to become because of him. Soon afterward, preparations began for Good Deed's return to his homeland. The king of Lishabhadra provided horses, attendants, gifts, and guards. His daughter would travel with her husband. Before leaving, Good Deed returned one final time to the orchard. He walked beneath the trees where he had once counted steps in darkness. He touched the trunk beneath which he had played music. He remembered arriving there with nothing. In that place, stripped of every title, he had learned something that palace teachers had never been able to teach him. A prince was not a prince because others announced it. A good man was not good because he was praised. Character remained when reputation disappeared. Compassion remained when reward disappeared. Truth remained when no witness stood nearby. He bowed to the garden keeper who had first given him work. The man now trembled with embarrassment. "Your Highness, I made you guard fruit." Good Deed laughed gently. "And I was grateful for the work." The keeper lowered his head. "I did not know who you were. That was one of the gifts you gave me." The man looked confused. Good Deed said, "You treated me according to what I could do, not according to a title. That is rarer than you think." Then the caravan departed. The journey home took many weeks. They crossed forests, rivers, dusty plains, and mountain passes. Every day, Good Deed wondered how his parents had changed. Did his mother still grieve for him? Had his father believed him dead? And what of Evil Deed? Did he sleep peacefully with the jewel he had stolen? Or had fear followed him home? At last, the towers of his homeland appeared in the distance. Good Deed stopped his horse. For a long moment, he simply looked. The same walls. The same road. The same hills he had seen before sailing away. Yet he was not the same man who had left. Word reached the capital before the caravan arrived. A rider rushed into the palace shouting, "The prince lives." At first, no one believed him. Then another messenger came. And another. The chief queen heard the news and dropped the cup in her hand. "Which prince?" "Good Deed." She began to shake. The king rose from his seat. "Do not lie to me." The messenger knelt. "I saw him with my own eyes." The old king left the palace before the formal procession could even be arranged. When he saw Good Deed approaching on horseback, he stopped in the road. For several breaths, father and son simply looked at one another. Then the king walked forward. Good Deed dismounted. The old man embraced him with such force that both nearly fell. "My son." Good Deed closed his eyes. "Father." The queen arrived moments later. When she touched his face, she began to weep. "I mourned you as dead." "I know. You were alive all this time?" "Yes." "Where were you?" Good Deed looked at both his parents. There is much to tell. That evening, the royal family gathered in private. Good Deed told them of the treasure island, of the overloaded ships, of the storm, of the 500 merchants lost beneath the waves. He told them how he saved Evil Deed. Then he came to the island. And he told them what happened there. When the king heard that Evil Deed had driven thorns into his brother's eyes and stolen the jewel, his face became red with fury. He stood so suddenly that the table shook. Guards! Good Deed rose as well. Father! The king turned. He blinded you. Yes. He abandoned you to die. Yes. He returned here and lied to us. Yes. And you still ask me to remain calm? Good Deed stepped closer. I ask you not to let his wrongdoing create another wrongdoing. The king stared at his son. But his anger was already moving toward judgment. Bring Evil Deed before me. And somewhere inside the palace, the younger prince finally heard the words he had feared from the day he returned: his brother was alive. When Evil Deed heard that his brother had returned, the jewel slipped from his hand. For a moment, he could not move. Since returning from the sea, he had lived with a secret fear. At first, he told himself that Good Deed could not possibly survive. A blind man abandoned on a distant island would die. Even if he somehow escaped the island, how could he cross foreign lands and return home? So Evil Deed had repeated the lie until even he almost believed it. The storm had taken everyone. He alone had survived. But fear never truly left him. Whenever footsteps approached his chamber unexpectedly, his heart tightened. Whenever merchants arrived from distant lands, he wondered what they had heard. Whenever he looked at the wish-fulfilling jewel, he remembered blood on his brother's face. Now the impossible had happened. Good Deed was alive. And he had returned. Guards came soon afterward. The king commands your presence. Evil Deed looked for a way to escape. There was none. He was taken through the palace corridors toward the great hall. Every step seemed louder than the last. When the doors opened, he saw his father seated upon the throne. The chief queen stood nearby. Foreign guests and ministers filled the hall. And beside the king stood Good Deed. Alive. Seeing. For an instant, Evil Deed thought he was looking at a ghost. Good Deed's eyes met his. The younger brother lowered his head immediately. The king's voice thundered through the hall. Look at him. Evil Deed did not move. I said look at your brother. Slowly, Evil Deed raised his face. The king pointed toward Good Deed. You told me he drowned. Evil Deed's lips trembled. I believed. You believed? The king rose. You drove thorns into his eyes. Silence fell over the court. You stole the jewel he had crossed the ocean to obtain. Evil Deed said nothing. You abandoned him blind upon an island. Still nothing. And then you returned to this palace and allowed your mother and me to mourn him as dead. The king's voice shook. What defense do you have? Evil Deed looked around the hall. There was no answer that could save him. At last he fell to his knees. I was afraid. The king stared at him. Afraid? Evil Deed's voice broke. I thought if he returned with the jewel, everyone would love him more. Good Deed listened silently. I thought he would become king. The younger prince lowered his head. And there would be nothing left for me. The king's face hardened. So you tried to destroy your brother because you feared his goodness? Evil Deed began to weep. I do not know what happened to me. Good Deed finally spoke. You knew. Evil Deed looked up. Good Deed's voice was gentle, but firm. On the island, you had time to choose. The younger brother froze. There was no storm forcing your hand. No enemy threatened you. You knew what you were doing. Evil Deed bowed his head again. These words hurt more than anger would have. Good Deed did not excuse him. Compassion did not require pretending that evil had not occurred. The king called to the guards. Take him away. At sunrise, he will be put to death. The guards stepped forward. Evil Deed closed his eyes. Then Good Deed moved between them. Father. The king looked at him. Stand aside. Good Deed knelt. Please spare his life. The entire hall became still. Even Evil Deed raised his head. The king seemed unable to understand what he had heard. Spare him? Yes. He blinded you. I remember. He left you to die. I remember. He stole from you and deceived us. I remember all of it. Then why? Good Deed looked toward his brother. Because killing him will not return what was lost. The king answered, it will give justice. Will it? Good Deed asked quietly. If he dies tomorrow, will the 500 merchants rise from the sea? The king said nothing. Will the knight's mother spent mourning disappear? No. Will my blindness never have happened? No. Then his death cannot repair the past. The king's anger remained. Some deeds deserve consequences. I agree. Good Deed's answer surprised him. Then let him face consequences. Let him surrender the jewel. Let him lose any claim to the throne. Let him live knowing what greed made him do. He paused. But do not kill him for my sake. The king looked at his eldest son. Why should you care whether he lives? Good Deed was silent for a moment. Then he said, because he is still my brother. Evil Deed covered his face. Good Deed continued, and because if I ask for his blood, then the night on that island will still be controlling my heart." The king slowly sat down. Good deed turned toward evil deed. "You wanted the jewel because you believed my good fortune would leave nothing for you." Evil deed wept. "But goodness is not a throne with only one seat." Good deed's voice softened. "My light never required your darkness." Those words broke something inside evil deed. He bent forward until his forehead touched the floor. "Brother." For the first time since the island, he spoke the word without envy. "I do not deserve your forgiveness." Good deed replied, "Forgiveness is not a declaration that you deserve what you did." He approached him. "It is my refusal to continue carrying what you did inside me." Evil deed reached into his clothing. His hands shook. He brought out the wish-fulfilling jewel. The same golden light filled the hall. He placed it on the floor before Good deed. "I took this from you." Good deed looked at it. "No." Evil deed stared at him. "You took it from the purpose for which it was sought." Good deed picked up the jewel. "Now let it return to that purpose." The king remained silent for a long time. At last he raised his hand. "The sentence of death is withdrawn." Evil deed collapsed in tears. "But you will not inherit this throne," the king continued. "You will live under your brother's protection and judgment. You will remember that your life remains because the man you tried to destroy asked that it be spared." Evil deed bowed until his head touched the floor. That night, Good deed stood alone upon a palace terrace. The jewel rested in his hands. He had crossed the ocean for it. He had lost his sight because of it. 500 merchants had died while chasing lesser treasures around it. Yet now, holding it again, he felt no triumph. He understood something he had not understood before leaving home. The most dangerous poverty was not always the absence of gold. A man could possess kingdoms and still believe there was not enough. A man could hold jewels and still feel poor whenever another person was praised. Greed was a hunger no treasure could satisfy. And generosity was not simply the act of giving wealth. Sometimes generosity meant giving another human being the chance to become different from the worst thing he had ever done. Good deed looked toward the sleeping city. Tomorrow, the jewel would finally be used. Not for revenge. Not for a crown. But for the promise that had begun the journey long ago, to relieve suffering wherever it could be relieved. The next morning, the palace gates were opened. Word had already spread through the capital that Prince Good deed had returned alive. But now another announcement was made. The prince would use the wish-fulfilling jewel for the people. At first, many thought it was only a royal ceremony. Then the crowds began to gather. The poor came first. Old men leaning upon staffs. Widows holding children by the hand. Laborers whose wages had never been enough. Families burdened by debt. Travelers without food. People who had spent years standing outside the edges of prosperity now stood before the palace. Good Deed emerged carrying the jewel. He wore no extravagant crown. He stood upon the palace terrace with his father, his mother, the princess, and many ministers behind him. Evil Deed was there as well. But he stood farther back. His head remained lowered. Good Deed lifted the jewel in both hands. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft golden light spread through the air. The crowd fell silent. The light grew brighter. It seemed to gather above the palace like a glowing cloud. Then, slowly, objects began to fall. Gold coins. Pearls. Small gems. Precious ornaments. Not in a violent storm, but gently, like warm rain. People cried out in amazement. Children laughed. Old women lifted their hands. Men who had spent their lives counting every coin stared upward as treasure fell around them. Good Deed raised his voice, "Take what is needed." The words traveled through the crowd. Do not take from fear. Some people stopped. Good Deed continued, "Do not gather simply because another person has more." His eyes moved across the sea of faces. Let wealth relieve suffering, not create another form of hunger. The people listened. What had happened to the merchants at sea was not forgotten. Good Deed ordered that the first gifts go to those most in need. Food was purchased. Debts were released. Homes were repaired. Medicine was provided. Orphans were supported. Old people who had no family received care. Farmers received seed and tools. Travelers were given provisions. For many days, the kingdom changed. Not because everyone became rich, but because desperation began to loosen its grip. The king watched his son and felt both pride and sorrow. One evening, he said, "You crossed the ocean to bring this jewel home." Good Deed looked at him. "Yes. You lost almost everything because of it." "Yes. And now you give its wealth away." Good Deed smiled. "That was why I wanted it." The king lowered his eyes. "When you were young, I thought generosity was only one of your virtues." Good Deed waited. "Now I understand it was also your strength." Some distance away, Evil Deed heard these words. In the past, praise for his brother would have filled him with bitterness. This time, it filled him with shame. But the shame no longer became anger. He allowed it to remain. He began to understand that remorse could either become another form of self-hatred or a doorway into change. In the months that followed, Evil Deed lived quietly. He surrendered all claim to the throne. He no longer wore the ornaments of a royal heir. He spent time among those receiving aid from the jewel. At first, people feared him. Some knew what he had done. Others had heard whispers. But Good Deed never encouraged public humiliation. He did not erase the truth. He simply refused to turn punishment into spectacle. One day, Evil Deed approached him. "You should hate me." Good Deed looked at him. "Would that help you become better?" "No." "Would it help me become better?" Evil Deed said nothing. Good Deed continued, "Then what purpose would it serve?" Evil Deed's eyes filled with tears. "I still remember the island every night." "You should remember it." The answer surprised him. Good Deed did not say, "Forget." He did not say, "It no longer matters." Instead, he said, "Remember clearly." Evil Deed looked at him. "Remember what greed made you capable of." Good Deed's voice remained calm. "But do not remember only so that you can punish yourself." "Then why?" "So that when greed appears again, you recognize its footsteps before it enters the house." Evil Deed bowed his head. For the first time in his life, he began to understand that forgiveness did not mean freedom from responsibility. It meant responsibility without hatred. Years passed. Good Deed became known throughout the kingdom not merely as the prince who possessed a miraculous jewel, but as the prince who had returned from betrayal without becoming cruel. People repeated his story. Some remembered the sea. Some remembered the blindness. Some remembered the truth vow of the princess. But the wise remembered something else. They remembered that when Good Deed finally stood before the brother who had destroyed his eyes, he did not deny justice. He denied hatred. And the difference between those two things became the heart of the story. When the Buddha reached this point, Vulture Peak was silent. The monks sat motionless beneath the night sky. Ananda listened. The Blessed One then said, "Ananda, the prince called Good Deed in that former life was I myself." The monks looked toward him. "And the prince called Evil Deed was Devdatta." Ananda lowered his eyes. Now he understood. The compassion he had witnessed was not indifference. It was not weakness. It was not forgetfulness. The Buddha remembered the harm. He simply refused to allow harm to determine the quality of his own heart. The Blessed One continued, "Hatred does not become pure because it is called justice. Compassion does not become foolish because it remembers a wrong. To forgive is not to say that evil is good. It is to refuse to become evil in return." The wind moved gently across the mountain. The monks remained silent. Far below, the lights of Rajagriha flickered in the darkness. Ananda bowed. He thought of Devdatta. He thought of the drunken elephant, the falling stone, the plots, the jealousy. Then he thought of the prince on the island, blind, bleeding, abandoned, still unable to hate. And suddenly, the teaching became clear. Compassion was not measured by how gently one treated those who were gentle. Anyone could love the person who loved them. Anyone could give kindness where kindness was returned. The deeper test came when kindness was met with betrayal, when trust was answered with harm, when one had every reason to harden the heart. Good deed had lost his ships, his companions, his jewel, his eyes, his home. Yet the one thing he refused to surrender was the quality of his own mind. And because he protected that, everything else that truly mattered eventually returned. His sight returned. His family returned. His purpose returned. Even the jewel returned. But more important than all of them, compassion remained. That was the treasure the ocean could not drown. The thief could not steal. The thorn could not blind. And the king could not command. The Buddha looked upon the assembly. Guard this treasure well. No one spoke. There was nothing more to add. Above them, the stars remained quiet. And beneath those ancient stars, the story of two brothers came to an end. Not with victory over an enemy. Not with revenge. But with a man who refused to let another person's darkness become his own.